All right, welcome everyone. Here we are to talk today about something that caused a little bit of controversy for
A
us.
little bit?
So, it was the most popular video that we had, and it was Spartans versus Mongols. And apparently people took offense to the idea
That
that
the Spartans wouldn't win something, because I think everyone has a very idealized view of the Spartans. And like, let's be real, they are cool. I
Yes.
love cool things. I'm very passionate about cool things. So, I get it. But there's reality.
There's reality that we have to consider. So for today's video, what we're going to do is we're going to essentially explain why it is that in a matchup between Spartans and Mongols, why the Mongols are going to come out on top. So first off, let's go ahead and talk about the combatants' equipment. So on one hand, you have a heavily armed Spartan infantryman. This is something that was known as a hoplite. Now, a hoplite was a citizen soldier of a Greek city-state. They were typically equipped with a shield known as a hoplon, which is where the hoplite came from. This was a shield that weighed anywhere between 14 to 18 pounds, extremely heavy, in a concave design that allowed it to be rested on one shoulder. At the same time, they would be equipped with a bronze cuirass, if they were wealthy enough to afford one, or it would be a type of multi-layered fabric known as a linothorax that was fabric that had been glued together. This is something that most soldiers would have had, especially in the case of a Spartan army, because men they did not receive equipment, they had to supply it themselves.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. What type of military makes you buy your own weapons?
Most militaries throughout history until the modern era. It really was not until, like, the Romans under the Marian reforms is actually a state that paid for the equipment of its soldiers. Even in Rome's early days, the way that you determined the pecking order in the military where you belonged between the veletae, which were the lightest armed, you had the hastati, the principes, and the triarii, or the equites. Depending on what equipment you could afford as well as your experience, that would determine your position in the army. Because if you were the poorest, then you were a skirmisher that was on the front lines, and you're going to get shot at with arrows and not have much protection.
I would love to see the US Army with exactly that. So we keep their pay the exact same, and then they also have to buy their own weapons. I would love to see it, you guys. Anyway.
So to go back to the topic that we were talking about here, as I said, hoplon shield, and they would have what was known as either a dori or a doru. And this was the spear that was 7 to 9 feet in length. It could be shorter or it could be longer, depending on the city-state that you belong to, but most commonly it was 6 to 9 feet in length. In addition to this, you have the heavy breastplate that we would speak about, you would have heavy bronze greaves, and on top of that, you would have a helmet, of which there were varying designs. Now, altogether, this equipment weighed anywhere between 50 to 70 pounds. It was extremely heavy. Yes, it was very heavy. What this meant is that Spartan and Greek soldiers, but especially Spartans, were classified as heavy infantry. They were slow-moving, but powerful, good for extended combat, but at the same time not mobile. Now, on the other hand, you have the Mongols. Now, Mongols were almost entirely made up of cavalry. They did not utilize infantry with the exception of soldiers that were from auxiliary or client states that would serve them and were drafted into the military. But if we're talking about a Mongol army itself, then this is something that is composed entirely of horsemen. Now, there was a ratio. 6 out of every 10 Mongol soldiers were horse archers. These were very lightly armed, equipped with bows, more likely a sword as a sidearm. They would have a coat that was heavy and would protect against arrows, but it was, or sometimes would protect against arrows, but it was not heavy equipment at all. This enabled them a high degree of mobility. On top of that, they were equipped with a horn bow. Now, this horn bow was a composite bow that was a combination between horn, bone, sinew, and wood. Now, this was a bow that did not function well in wet climates, But on its own, where it came from, on a dry day, if it was protected from the rain, it was extremely powerful. In fact, Mongols were capable of shooting accurately at targets up to 500 feet, and able to shoot in a general area as part of a bombardment tactic up to 1,200 feet. So, they had range. Now, if you look at either's military tactics, the way that Spartans fought battles was in a phalanx formation. The Spartan military was almost entirely composed of this heavy infantry, but at the same time, they did have auxiliary forces. If you recall, one of the big criticisms was people saying, oh, well, the Spartans had cavalry. Oh, they had these ranged troops. They could totally take on the Mongols. They did have other troops, but they were not the core of the army, and at the same time, they had a lot of issues. The Spartans' focus was exclusively on the phalanx. They only introduced other types of auxiliary forces, namely cavalry, skirmishers, and other troops, during either times of crises or when they were forced to adapt them. So, Spartan cavalry. They did have it, which were known as, hippiatoi, or hippietes. It's kind of hard to actually pronounce it, because I don't speak Greek. But what this was a type of citizen cavalry that was made up of the wealthiest Spartans that were not good enough to be the infantry. Now see, normally, in most societies, this is the reverse. In most societies, the best trained, wealthiest, and most powerful men joined the cavalry. But this was not the case for the Greeks, especially the Spartans. In order to be a cavalryman in the Spartan nation, you had to be wealthy to be able to afford your own horse, afford your own armor, afford the upkeep for all that, but at the same time, you weren't actually good enough or powerful enough to be in the infantry.
I would get a horse if I were Spartan. It's all I got from that.
So, what this effectively means is that these were not trained men, they could ride a horse and they could afford good armor, but they were not trained good soldiers that were able to fight as proper cavalry. On top of that, they're ranged soldiers. There were two types of classifications.
They can throw spears though. That was one of the comments that came up a lot.
Well, you did not throw your spear as a Spartan because that was your primary weapon.
Oh.
You did not do this.
Do they have javelin?
They did, which is one of the two types that I'm about to talk about here.
Sorry.
No, it's good to jump in on this. So there are two types of ranged units that you would have. This was typically peltists, which peltists were going to be light to medium armed men that carried javelins that would serve as skirmishers out on the flanks and the front. And then you would also have slingers. They did use bowmen, but bows were not a common tool necessarily used with the Greeks, with the exception of Cretan archers. So, what you would have, the ones who would be using these ranged weapons, were two types of people, helots and perioikoi. Now, the perioikoi were the non-citizens of Sparta. They were the men who, they served the Spartan state, they were not slaves, but at the same time they were not allowed to be citizens. These were the men who were the craftsmen, the traders, the producers of Spartan society, but they were not the military men. So they could act as either slingers, but more often they would act as peltists. At the same time, you had the helots. Now, the helots were slaves. They were slaves that were drafted into the military, and they were oftentimes equipped with slings. And a sling is a great weapon, don't get me wrong, but these were slaves that were not trained in war, forcefully drafted into the military, and the Spartans did not give a shit what happened to them. They were slaves.
That must be great for morale.
Nope. But if they fled, they would get stabbed in the back by Spartans. Yeah, that's how that worked.
This is just making me think they're not as cool as the 300 made them seem.
Nope, absolutely not. In fact, that whole line about the Spartans fighting for their freedom, they were far more oppressive than any Persian. The Persians were oftentimes the liberators in many areas.
Yeah, actually, one comment was like, are we going to talk about how these Spartans are glorified, but they were the ones causing most of the trouble? And I was like, I don't know what you mean, buddy, but I'm not even going to get into it.
Yep. Now, when you take that into consideration, you have to analyze their battle tactics. So the Spartans, on one hand, would utilize a phalanx. This was a tight rectangular formation of men that was approximately 8 ranks deep. Each man would be equipped with a spear and a shield and his heavy armor and would be planted in a formation that, at first, when walking, the spear would be carried underhand, and this could be used for stabbing. But more often, when battle was engaged, the soldier would switch to an overhand strike that would enable them to reach the spear over a shield and stab at a man behind it. This is a tactic that was used in this very tight formation. Now, this interlocking shield of hoplites was such a tight formation that you could not get out of it. You were not mobile. The moment that the phalanx started to break and people started to leave it or men die, it essentially broke and fell apart, which is why it being a static, immobile wall was so incredibly important. On the flanks of the phalanx, you would have the perioikoi and helot, peltists, and slingers that would be, again, running flanking maneuvers and trying to keep enemies at bay.
Did they get shields?
Perioikoi sometimes did. Helots, no one gave a shit what happened to the helots.
I hate this.
Now, on the other hand, you have the Mongols. Now, the Mongol tactic was far more devastating in this case. Because what the Mongols would do is that when they would first enter into a battle, the army would typically split into 2 or 3 parts. This is right before the battle. And what they would do is they would seem to appear to the enemy in all directions at once, because they would never be able to tell where the army was coming from. But let's ignore that, because that oftentimes is considered psychological warfare before going into battle. When battle would commence, the immediate action that the Mongols would take was to first send in the horse archers. Now, the horse archers would run circles around their enemy, or would run up to them, get somewhat close enough just within the range of the enemy's ranged weapons, and then they would retreat back. And they would repeat this cycle over and over and over again, wearing them down. So here's how I want you to imagine this playing out. Let's say that you have a heavily armed force. You have 1,000 Spartans versus 1,000 Mongols. And the Spartan force is going to be comprised of 60% heavily armed Spartans and 40% skirmishers. At the same time, just as you have the 60% horse archers and the 40% heavy lancers of the Mongols. That way, we can give them a fairly even ratio. In that scenario, what is going to happen first is that the horse archers are going to move forward first. They are going to be able to hit the slingers, and they are going to be able to hit the peltists at a significantly greater range. Then what is going to happen is as they close and the enemy tries to shoot at them, they are going to retreat. They are going to retreat back. They are going to get more arrows from the camels that are stationed behind the battle where they have more quivers waiting. Because people would say, like, oh, they're just going to run out of ammunition eventually. No, that is not what happened with the Mongols. The Mongols kept a constant supply of arrows. Each soldier was equipped with 2 to 3 quivers. A single quiver would have 60 arrows in it. So, what this means is that a Mongol would go into battle immediately with between 120 to 180 arrows to start.
That's a lot of arrows.
That's a lot of arrows. On top of that, if they started to run low, they would retreat out of the battle, get more arrows, and come back. Those peltists and slingers are going to be eradicated within the first hour of battle almost instantly, leaving nothing but the heavy infantry. Then what is going to happen, let's say that the Mongols close, that they go into a melee. Several of them are going to die, it's going to be bad, but the Mongols avoided frontal charges at all costs. What they did do was called a feigned retreat. So they would close into melee, maybe a couple of them would get killed, and then they would break away. They would pretend to be retreating. And as they would retreat, their other forces would circle around the enemy, and as the enemy formation starts to break to take after them and stab them in the back, The heavy lancer would close in from all sides and crush them. And as the enemy scattered, the Mongols would break into small groups, hunting each and every group down. Here's what you have to understand. The Spartan phalanx was nigh on invincible from a frontal charge. Frontal charges are what the Mongols avoided at all costs. They would whittle their enemy down to nothing, bleeding them dry. That is why they would win.
So, people were like, what if the Spartans just made a circle shield? You're not getting through it.
This is a formation that is known as a schiltron.
Did they do that a lot?
Not a lot. They could technically do it, but this was not a formation that was practiced.
But what if they did? Say they see the Mongols have horses, they're like, nah, man. Would they do that?
Let's assume that they did. And let's assume that the Mongols then continuously fired arrows at them. People think that shields are invincible, that an arrow is going to hit a shield and that it is going to be blocked.
Well,
this is not necessarily the case.
We need to know how strong the shield is and how strong the arrow is. And I guess if enough arrows hit a really strong shield, it'll break at some point. Plus, what if their arms get tired? You're doing this for hours.
Eventually, you are going to be exhausted.
Eventually,
remember,
an arrow's going to hit and you'll be like, ow.
This is, yes, actually. No, that's actually the case. These shields weighed up to 18 pounds. Imagine carrying around an 18-pound weight for hours at a time.
I would do it for like 3 minutes. Like, you guys saw 3 minutes out of me and then be like...
Which is why these formations, historically speaking, phalanxes did not fall apart because of men getting killed. Phalanxes fell apart because men got tired. And the moment men got tired and they started to break and the formation faltered, chaos would ensue and they would get wiped out.
Okay. People were wondering, how would they even meet in this battle? Because in the TikTok, some people were like, oh, so the Spartans are just all of a sudden surrounded. Why would they let themselves get surrounded? I'm like, well, the Mongols have horses. It'd take 2 seconds to surround people on foot. But I didn't want to say that. How would they meet in this hypothetical battle?
Let's assume it's a hypothetical in which they meet somewhere in Greece. Now, Greece largely has rocky outcroppings. It's not really a good place for cavalry in the first place. But the Mongol horses that they rode were small ponies, meaning they would actually function in Greece significantly better than, say, a large war stallion from Central Europe would be. And as a result of this, their highly mobile force could pin the Spartans at any point. See, they did not really engage in sieges. This wasn't something that was very common necessarily among the Greeks. You met your enemy outside on the field of battle. Even assuming that there are rocky outcroppings and defensive mountains that the Spartans could take a defensive position on, all you need to do is whittle them down with arrows, and eventually they'll be forced to retreat and break out.
Alright. So, my favorite comment was, have you ever seen the movie 300? It was 300.
Yeah, yes it was.
And that was justification of how the Mongols would lose to the Spartans. And I just want to say, it was a really cool movie, actually. Yeah, I would use that as an argument.
Just because they were half naked.
I know, but I would use that as an argument, too. I truly believe that movies and how cool you look is a factor in determining who will win a battle. Truly, like, if I was, like, wearing cool armor, I could beat him in a fight. Okay, so I don't really pay attention to anything you usually say because it's super hard for me. It's usually boring. I don't know what you're saying, but I was able to visualize this battle and I actually learned so much. So, yeah, it was pretty nice. Actually, I never listened that much.
Well, I'm glad you did, and I hope that anyone watching this did too.
And any questions you have about this video or just like details or specifics of it, feel free to ask in the comments below. He will respond to them. I will read them to him.
I would like to thank everyone for watching here. I'm pretty sure at some point we will get a more established outro for how to go about this. One of the common criticisms that we did receive from the last video was that the ending was extremely abrupt.
It's because the camera died.
The camera died. Just putting it out there. And I didn't deign to edit anything in.
Yeah, it was like 2 a.m. But thank
Yes,
you for watching. Please, like, comment, subscribe, and just thank you for supporting us and letting us be able to do this.
And let us know what it is that you would like to cover next, because as you can see from this video, which at this point is probably going over 20 minutes, I can talk a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover about these, like, what ifs, because in every single battle, there's, like, so much to consider, especially when you're putting two people from different ages up against each other. Like, you're not going to be able to actually have a fair fight. Like, no matter what you do, you can always swing it so that the other one wins or this one wins if you just change a few things like terrain or armor, numbers.
Yep. Which is why the one thing that I want you to keep in mind for any future videos, anything that you watch from us, please understand that nothing that we say here is set in stone. Everything that we cover is just a logical thought process for how a battle or event or something would more than likely play out. It is never absolute, and one must never, ever make certain that their plans are absolute in war.
I think the biggest takeaway from these should be, like, the fighting styles, the armor, just, you know, the general stuff, like the knowledge about the people participating. You should take that away from it. But you should always know that if you change a few little things in the scenario, you can get a different outcome, which is what a lot of people are doing in the comments.
Yes.
They're like, oh, that's not true. But then they change something. And I'm like, yeah, if you change that, of course, they will win. So you always have to consider that. These are hypotheticals, and we
But
never
what if we
actually
gave the
know.
Spartans guns?
What if we gave them horses? Like, I mean, that
The Spartans did not train on horses, I can tell you that much. So
you know, like, there's just a lot to consider, and we'd never know the answers for real unless we got, like, actual soldiers from that time to reenact this, and I don't have a time machine yet. Working on it, though. But
you're a biologist.
okay, people don't seem to know the difference between the sciences, so, like, I can invent a time machine. I took 2 physics classes, okay?
Anyway, this was less of an outro and more of a last final rambling, which, you know, might end up actually being our outros if that is the case. Either way, I hope you enjoyed, and
Thanks for watching!
thanks for watching.